Okay, well, thank you for coming out for this very last moment of Groundswell. You've obviously oozing endurance and capability to take more and more information on. So myself and my colleague Will are going to talk about the threats for weeds and weed management in regenerative agriculture. But Will is actually going to go on after I've talked about the nature of the threat as we perceive it and some of the important principles we've got to understand, and talk about opportunities, talk about some alternative tools for what is basically direct mechanical weed control in crop. So options like inter-row mechanical weeding, which has been a big focus of ours over the last 3 or 4 years, but then particularly today focusing on the potential of harvest weed seed control as a tool for regenerative agriculture. So first off, I've got to say in the seminar program, I was very surprised to see that there are twice as many mentions of cheese as there are of weed management. I think that is a total misunderstanding of where the real threats and risks for adoption and transition into regenerative agriculture lie. I mean, I may exaggerate and I may have misunderstood the context of the cheese talks, but nevertheless, I think this is a topic that we need to take much more seriously if we want to look at changing systems and adopting different practices. So, first of all, I want to really make clear what are the key differences from the weed management point of view, from the weed biology point of view, in terms of switching to regenerative system or conservation agriculture system. Talk about the practical experience. What particular species are we seeing and when do we need to keep an eye open for? And then talk about a really fascinating case study that's been carried out in France. I mean, France, they've got a very formalized and subsidized, in fact, but a very formalized package around conservation agriculture uptake. So they have looked at surveying a large number of growers, in fact, over 50 growers who have adopted conservation agriculture, some of whom up to 14 years, but they can look at the time period as an interesting parameter. And I really wanted to talk about that experience, which is now published in a few papers, but bring it back to our UK situation and understand how important it is to understand that with respect to us. I want to talk about a couple of elephants which are in the room around regen conservation agriculture, which, and I'll tell you straight up front, for me, it is the sustainable use of glyphosate in these systems, and also where do we see the role of inversion cultivation with respect to weed management? Do we see it as having a role, or do we see it as a tool that we want to completely move away from? And then, as I say, Will is going to, having depressed the hell out of you, hopefully Will is going to send you away with a little bit of hope in your heart. So, first of all, the key feature from the weed biology point of view of a regenerative system or a conservation agriculture system is that we completely restructure the physical nature of the weed seed bank. So this is just an example of some work that we did, 2-year direct drilled site, so 0 till, 0 secondary cultivation, with in fact a slot drill and a deep non-inversion system. And what you can see straight away is the key difference between the non-inversion and the direct drill. We have accumulated weed seeds in this surface zone, this top 5 centimetre zone. The top 5 centimetre zone is the live part of the seed bank where we can recruit seedlings into the crop from, and all the rest is a long-term persistent seed bank. So we've massively restructured the seed bank to get an accumulation of weed seeds in that live surface layer. But if you look at the number of seedlings in the crop, at the same time, because of the no-till drilling, we reduce the proportion of that pool that we cause to germinate. So we're doing those two things at once, and it's really important to understand that. In fact, in this trial, the net effect of reducing the number of seeds in that live pool, reducing the proportion of those seeds which is caused to germinate, the net effect was exactly the same. So it's really important when you think about no-till drilling, you want to reduce that stimulation for weed seeds to germinate. You are achieving that, and in this trial, we actually looked across 3 sites, that reduction was something like 20 to 30%. But you are talking about running a system with a larger weed seed bank available for germination in any one crop. So that's a short-term observation after a couple of years of direct drill. This is just some data from a long-term direct drill trial, which now has been carrying out near Cambridge, where most of the weed in this system is actually blackgrass. And just to make the point that even after long-term adoption of true direct drilling, so no secondary cultivation. We see this restructuring where you have a accumulation of weed seeds in the surface zone. But two things, there are always natural processes which cause weed seeds to move deeper down the soil profile than the cultivated area. Cracks, biological activity. But this seed bank observation, these deep seeds, are a completely different phenomena than they are in a cultivated system. So these deep seeds are totally lost to the system. They are a massive benefit. They will not be reinterred by cultivation. Whereas obviously in a cultivated system, the deeper seeds act as that long-term reservoir for seed, for continuously bringing seed back up. So we see that restructuring, but even in a long-term system, there will be seeds lost out of the soil profile to deeper than the cultivation depth. So one thing around this topic, when you start to look at seed banks, you start to look at recruitment, the number of weeds, relate them to the number of seeds. And this is really important to understand. The relationship of plants above ground to weed seeds in that top 5 centimetre pool is simply not as large as you imagine. So we are talking about the seedling population across these 3 sites where we had slightly different drill systems is around about ballpark 5 to 10%. So in a completely undisturbed system or even in a disturbed system, you think that you're seeing all of these weed seeds germinate. Brilliant. They're all gone now. I can drill the crop. That flush of weed seeds, one cohort at a time, is about 5 to 10% of the total seed bank. And that means because not all the fresh seed germinates immediately, even in an undisturbed system, you have got seed bank persistence for the long term. So I do hear, and I'm sure some of you hear it as well, oh, it's a no-till system. We just keep the weed seeds on the soil surface or around the soil surface. We don't have a persistent seed bank. We're not burying any. Well, because only 5 to 10% germinate in each cohort, you will have a persistent seed bank, even though it is at that shallow depth. So the other element of a no-till system, a true no-till system now around the conservation or regenerative agriculture compliant, if you like, is that we need to think about weed seeds on the soil surface a lot more. So we have got used to quite a regularized, predictable system around cultivated systems where you've got some seed burial that we can predict, that we can understand and describe. You've got a big stimulation to germinate around drilling, which causes predictability and regularity in the germination habits of the weeds. We're moving away from that completely, where we've got weed seeds on the soil surface, subject to direct mortality. We can cultivate, put them into this surface zone, try and get them to germinate, so-called stale seed bed, lethal germination. And because these 2 different pathways for seed losses are different in different seasons, one of the features of no-till systems is that they are not as regularized, predictable, and similar each year. They're subject to a lot more variability year to year, depending on the season. So I do like to quote this. A paper by a group of weed scientists in 1988. Before anyone asks, no, I'm not the Cussans in this paper, but they made the point, looking at very early work on blackgrass, cultivations consistently increase germination of freshly shed blackgrass seeds. You cultivate, superficial cultivation, you get a nice flush. There's no evidence that this reduces blackgrass in subsequent crops. We really need to understand that. So we've got persistency, unpredictability, and amplified in systems with very little seed burial. The other key thing, which I think we need to sort of conceptualize and get a head around with regen or conservation ag systems, we are changing. You have a system in which you are achieving weed control from a whole different set of routes. We are completely changing the balance of where the weed control is coming from in this system. We are amplifying the importance of pre-drilling total weed control by taking away direct mechanical weeding, which is what cultivation can represent. We are obviously hopefully increasing the role of rotational sequence and perennial phases. But we need to look at the system in the round and see where the real pressure is in this system. And we'll talk about it in a moment. I think the main feature from a weed management point of view, if you think about the balance of weed control in the system in total, is that by reducing direct mechanical weeding in intercropping periods, because you're taking away cultivation, taking away seed burial, we are just hyper-reliant on pre-drilling total weed control to start crops with no established weeds. And that puts an awful lot of pressure on the glyphosate, or however we're achieving that pre-drilling total weed control. And that, I think, is one of the elephants in the room that I want to talk to at the moment. And obviously more perennial phases in the rotation, rotational sequences. We are hopefully decreasing our reliance on in-crop weed control. So I want to talk about specific weed species that we are seeing emerge and develop, the real key weeds which seem to be tagged on specifically to the initial adoption of no-till, and then use the French experience to expand on that, talk about some of the weeds that they're seeing slightly longer term. So obviously something we're not going to focus on a great deal. We're seeing the continued development of herbicide resistance and trends in existing weeds, particularly around no-till, the movement towards meadow and ryebrome, increasing frequency. So we used to, in terms of bromes, we used to be dominated by sterile brome. These are two species which are particularly suited to no-till systems. We see that as more and more of an issue. And then when you add in the fact that we're beginning to see limited cases of resistance to contact herbicides in these bromes, it really is something that we need to keep a focus on. We are seeing what are basically failures of biosecurity. Invasive species coming into the UK. We have got, at least in the transition nationally towards a different kind of system, a demand for non-crop seeds, novel seeds, which totally exceeds the ability of us to produce them in the UK. If you're using a middleman, the key question is where the hell is all this seed coming from? And I'll show you a couple of examples of some really, really worrying examples of a breakdown of biosecurity around imported non-crop seeds. We've got a very clear pattern of ubiquitous native species whose biology is particularly suited to no-till systems, which have been excluded by cultivation, coming in, invading no-till crops and becoming quite problematic. And the two most obvious examples are rat's tail fescue and bird chervil. These really are a key indicator footprint. As a weed scientist, you want to pull off a nice trick in the fields, have a walk round, there's a bit of bird chervil, you say to the grower, are you using a direct drill? And somehow you seem like a god, because there's such a clear indicator of that switch to that particular system. And we're also beginning to see, this is going to be a much longer term trend, again, not just in the UK, but elsewhere, just beginning to see species, and I say capable of perenniation, so not necessarily perennial species per se, but species which are capable of biennial habit, things like hemlock, which is particularly worrying, but also cow parsley and willow herb. These are, because of that absence of physical mechanical weeding, with the absence of cultivation, hyper-reliant on pre-drilling weed control, glyphosate often. If that isn't 100% effective, these are perennating and being quite difficult in the following crop. So this example, I mean, this is a particularly worrying example. I can't emphasize enough how alongside a journey into regenerative agriculture or conservation agriculture, just really bringing up that level of monitoring, understanding what's happening in the fields is so important. This is an Orobanche species. This is actually Orobanche minor. This has come in as a contaminant of some vetch seed. This is a very, very common parasitic weed in southern Europe of these vetch species. The way that you control these parasitic weeds is to stop growing the host. You're waiting for the next control measure. There is no other control measure. So keeping these species out of our system is absolutely vital. This is one example of, just because nice photo, there have been several cases of this coming in vetch seed. This is actually Dodder, this is Cuscuta. Again, come in as a contaminant of the clover element of this fertility building phase. Where did you get the seed from? I don't know, you might as well have bought it off eBay. There's total failure of biosecurity here, bringing these species into this country. If this becomes established, you can no longer use this tool in your regenerative system. So really ramp up that level of monitoring, question where the seed is coming from. Hopefully it's a transition as the demand for these kind of species that we haven't been using a lot, it starts to be met by domestic production. But to think that there is a couple of 1,000 hectares worth of old site clover out there just waiting for us to call on is fanciful. Where's that seed coming from? So this is another example, incredibly common example of a weed seed being brought into the UK. This is actually barnyard grass, Echinoclea cruscalii. This is in a spring wheat crop. It's come over the road from a game cover crop. Globally, this is probably in the top 3 or 4 weeds. C4 weeds, so as soon as you're growing late spring crops like maize, you can get this weed in. This is coming in as a contaminant of game cover. Incredibly frequent contaminant. Globally, there are more herbicide resistance traits in this weed species than you can count. Unbelievably difficult to manage. Where is this seed coming from? What part of Europe do we think it's coming from? So really watch out for that in game covers. Again, it will come through into your, again, part of the journey, hopefully is more diverse cropping. If we get this into our crops, we're in a very difficult situation. And again, these seem like slightly more prosaic species, but species like bird chervil, Anthriscus caucalis, can be incredibly aggressive in the crop. This is an almost ubiquitous natural, semi-natural species. As soon as you take away that exclusion of mechanical weeding, disturbance, soil mixing, you can get this species coming in straight away. Again, short term, you can get these. This is rat's tail fescue, Vulpium iurus. This is a slightly related species, but you can see the botanical maps show it's almost ubiquitous. Take away the cultivation, you will get this as a weed in your system quite quickly. Easy to manage initially, but once it becomes established and abundant, very difficult to manage. Globally, it's a really problematic weed of no-till systems elsewhere. And lastly, my favourite, this is an absolutely terrible photo taking at speed from a Hilux, but that is my life. This is actually something called hemlock. This whole patch in the middle that you can't see, this is hemlock in an oilseed rape crop. We'll start killing people if we get this weed in our crops that are due to go into the food chain. This is a poisonous weed, okay, which everyone just thinks is cow parsley. If you see this weed coming up in your verges or even coming into your crops, it's got this characteristic mottling on the stem. You really, really need to actively manage it. This is a problem where councils and so on who formerly would have taken responsibility for managing this on roadside verges and sort of slightly abandoned parts of the world and no longer actively controlling it. There's an enormous reservoir of seed coming in. You've got no-till system. You can get this weed established. Really quite important to understand that. So I wanted to talk a little bit and share some experiences from some colleagues who are involved in an EU project with us. This is work carried out at INRAE in France, led by a guy called Bruno Chevel. He actually can't be here today because he was speaking at a European Weed Research Conference yesterday. And I am in no way suggesting that I would rather be in Athens with a group of other weed nerds than here, but he couldn't join us today because of that. So they've looked at adoption. As I say, it's really important to understand conservation agriculture is a formalised construct in France where you're either in or you're out. They've looked at the difference between conventional farmers, 50 individual farmers and 50 fields, and then slightly over 50 who had adopted conservation agriculture. Because France is such an enormous territory that goes across environmental zones, there are different weeds in different parts of France. So they've broken it down and looked at community structure, but then they have a slightly abstract, so they're not talking about individual species. So they are talking about adoption of minimum soil disturbance, increasing both the diversity abundance, but also the richness of species. Increasing the abundance is not a good thing. That means more weeds. Increasing the richness arguably is. And they are seeing exactly the same patterns that we're seeing. perennial species initially, widely dispersed species like our bird chervil and vulpia, small seeded species which are capable of long distance dispersal, invading these habitats. Higher adoption of permanent vegetation cover as one of those 3 pillars. The abundance is dropping as a result of this approach. The richness is staying the same, but they're seeing a trend towards so species which are large seeded, capable of competing with these established covers. So quite a strong trend towards that, and also shade tolerant species alongside it. And then a diversified rotation, the other pillar, obviously, reducing the diversity of abundance, increasing the diversity of weed species, which is a very positive feature. If we want to use weed species community structure as an indicator of the health of farmland, certainly in field, which is not a bad shout, we need to understand how these systems might impact on that. And then in toto, across all of these 3 different elements, they're seeing increases in species richness. But actually, for people who are adopting all 3 pillars strongly, not an increase in weed abundance. So they are having effective management in those systems, which is an important finding. So as I say, different dynamics. So they measured to what extent people are adopting the 3 pillars, and they see different influences of the 3 different elements, not surprisingly, and then an overall effect for people who are adding all 3 up and getting this. So they see trends both in new species, as we are seeing, but also in existing species, again, as we are seeing. Crucially, I guess, for the adoption of regenerative agriculture or conservation agriculture in the UK, the outcome does depend strongly on to what extent you deploy each of these different elements. And that's going to be really, really important. But one of the comments in Bruno's presentation was it is a truism. If you embark on a transition with a very difficult weed problem, you will end the transition with that weed as a problem. So, you know, managing that transition, managing the weeds that exist in order to make that change is really important. This is a slightly too smaller slide for this, but one of the other elements that they looked at is they did interviews with all the farmers. They split them down into growers who hadn't started conservation agriculture, so they had signed up to get the subsidy and to do it. People who were starting out in the first few years, and then growers who had mastered it. So they were happy and they got into the system. They were 5-6 years plus into the system. And they asked them, what weed management approaches are you using? And there's some really fascinating trends. This is an open access paper. So if you Google Bruno Chauvel and France conservation agriculture, you'll find this really fascinating analysis. And they found some elements like trying to control the weeds in the intercropping period. So in those, whether you're relay cropping, a cover crop or a catch crop, trying to actively manage the weeds in the intercropping period. The people who started the conservation agriculture process really focused on that. As they got more and more mature and they'd run the system for several years, the focus on that dropped right away. So for us, let's not worry too much about managing the weeds in the non-crop phase. The whole point of the ground cover, the non-crop phase, managing it that way is you've got effective weed control. Because the weed species that they were managing was changing, there was a change towards post-emergence. That's what the PO rather than the PR is. There was a change strongly towards post-emergence herbicide use. It's really interesting that one of the elements of conservation agriculture adoption is a good optimization around the use of herbicides. And I think that's important for us as well. And as I say, a very strong indication, perhaps the strongest indication, that the farmers who in long-term conservation agriculture had best mastered the system were those that were using the widest range of weed management tools that were available to them. And I think that is a pretty obvious steer for ourselves. So I want to talk quickly about a couple of elephants that are sitting in the room. Sustainable glyphosate use, inversion cultivation. It's gone quite well so far. So the point I want to make, you change the balance of weed management in the system. You think about the whole system, where's the weed management coming from? We increase the reliance to the point of it being absolutely critical around pre-drilling total weed control. For us in the UK, At the moment, that's glyphosate for the most part. If you have broadleaf weed, mainly broadleaf weeds, crimp roller type approaches, physical destruction without cultivation are an option. For grass weeds, they are not effective. So we're very reliant on glyphosate to start the crop as clean as possible. There's more selection pressure on this active because more of the weed control is coming from that area. It is absolutely critical if we're going to successfully make this transition and hopefully see less weed pressure in the future that we look after glyphosate in the meantime. So we've got 4 species that we worry about in the UK. Blackgrass, sterile brome, rat sterile fescue. Looks like it may be an issue globally around glyphosate sensitivity. Italian ryegrass. Several studies, which we won't go into, but essentially in blackgrass, we found something like a 2-fold difference between the most sensitive and the least sensitive blackgrass populations across a range of 50. With sterile brome, there's quite a nice piece of work where they found 35 populations. Only one stood out. That was a 3.4-fold difference. So we are seeing differentiation in these species with respect to glyphosate sensitivity. We have all the raw ingredients that we need to ruin this herbicide, to lose that effectiveness. Rat sterile fescue, we did some work over the winter. We saw a 3-fold difference. And the one I want to highlight, Italian ryegrass, there is a nearly 5-fold difference in Italian ryegrass populations with respect to glyphosate sensitivity. I mean, we do not have glyphosate resistance in the UK. We have never been closer. And it's really important to understand that as we embark on this change. So these are my 50 populations. We use a susceptible standard that we all share. This is actually a resistant standard that we were able to obtain. We've got a group of populations now where we're dropping below sensitivities where 1.5 litres is not giving effective control. There's a subset of these populations, maybe 3 or 4, where 3 litres is not giving effective control. So you can see what I mean about us being very close. So if you have Italian ryegrass in your system and you're thinking about no-till adoption, so I know there are people in this room who have not read the glyphosate stewardship document. Right? You shouldn't be here talking about weed management in this system if you have not read the glyphosate stewardship document. That's bottom line. So I also want to talk with respect to Italian ryegrass. Again, we've got the weed, we've got this differentiation around weed populations with respect to glyphosate. We've got one example of an experiment where we looked at a very high pressure situation, no mechanical seed control for 8 months. Survivors were surviving glyphosate. We actually dug up some plants and did some experiments with them. This is a glyphosate resistant standard. These are field populations of Italian ryegrass. This is what we can do. So we can select a UK-sourced population of Italian ryegrass to have absolute out-and-out resistance to UK. If we can do it, you can do it. So I think that's my elephant in the room. That's probably my number one. If you go away and remember that, and for God's sake, Google glyphosate stewardship guidelines. Hopefully we can. It's not an inevitability, but we've got all of the raw ingredients that we need for this to be a very significant problem. So the other elephant in the room, inversion cultivation. This is a beautiful photo of actually a meadow brome trial. It's the same meadow brome trial. Meadow brome is one of these species which is particularly associated with min-till. Got an absolute 0-till block, some shallow non-inversion, different treatments where we're looking at post-harvest cultivation strategies, ploughing, and more no-till. Over 95% effect on this weed in this field. The 0-till plots are really very challenging with respect to the weed. This is some work where we did looking at, as I say, we've got a very limited number, but an ALS-resistant meadow brome population in the UK. A nice little field trial. 26 herbicide treatments are untreated. There are no statistically significant differences between 26 herbicide treatments. The ploughing is 95% effective. So if we are going to not use this tool for this weed, we're going to really need some other tools to pick up the pressure. That's my message. I mean, I don't know where we sit with respect to ploughing in a regenerative system. Is it completely forbidden? Is it possible to be regen curious? Or do you have to complete the whole course before you can be regen? I don't know. But it's such a powerful tool for managing weeds, which are also associated with this system. I just want us to understand what we're giving up, if that's what we're going to do. So hopefully I scared the hell out of you. I see several people on their phones Googling glyphosate stewardship guideline. If that's the only thing I've achieved today, I'm a happy man. So now my colleague Will hopefully represents the future. He's going to talk about some of these options that we've got if we're going to dismiss some of the tools we've already got.
Yeah, good afternoon. So as John said, I'm Will Smith, so another weed management specialist with NIAB. I've been doing some work over the last 3 or 4 years looking at some of these alternative tools for weeding in narrow row systems. And part of that, or a really important part of that, has been inter-row cultivation, which is what I'll introduce to start with. And then we'll move on and have a look at some of these harvest weed seed control techniques, which we're going to be starting to look at this summer in quite a big way. So inter-row cultivation, inter-row mechanical weeding is a relatively old technology, really, in terms of the actual concept around how we're going to deliver it. However, it's been modernised over the last 10 years and is increasingly becoming more technological, using cameras to gain the crop selectivity so that it's safe and protects the crop while we're weeding. If we just look at the graph on the left-hand side, we've got a range of treatments, which is what I've been working on. So it's on a percentage control. You've changed the graph, John. So we've been testing it alongside herbicides. So in these 2 years, we've got the blue is 2020 and the yellow or orange is 2021. So if we're looking to use inter-row cultivation alone, this is in a conventional system with a very high background population of blackgrass. We are averaging somewhere around 30 to 40% weed control of blackgrass. It's a target that's quite difficult to get with inter-row cultivation because the tillering grass is capable of bouncing back from a level of cultivation. It's not like some of these broadleaf weeds where you take out taproot and there's near total control. However, we've also got problems with herbicides, and they are not the absolute solution. So between those 2 years, we had a lot larger variability, between 60 and 95% control from our herbicide program. Nothing silly, a very straightforward program, Liberator Defy, with some Atlantis thrown in post-M. But there's a very high variability with our herbicides. So if we begin to combine these two techniques, so we've got the herbicide program followed by 2 passes with inter-row cultivation, you're able to increase the control and also make it more robust. So although we're only adding in 2021, we only increased the level of control by 2 or 3%. It is higher, but in those years where our herbicides haven't been working as a result of conditions around the preem, but also resistance, particularly in blackgrass, is a large issue, we're able to increase the robustness of our control. Some of the other work I've included in this has been to look at some of the economics around these technologies, and combining the economic work that I've been doing with some of the work we'll do on the seed mills in the future will be really interesting to unlock the keys to how we can deliver some of these technologies on farm. So harvest weed seed control, as an outline, it's a technology. It's a group of non-chemical techniques, generally sort of machinery-based, technology-based, that are able to reduce the return of weed seeds during that harvest. And I'm including sort of pre-harvest operation, so weed surfing type approaches, just to sort of expanding out a little bit, but grouping these technologies all together. It's very popular in Australia, where they're struggling with Lolium rigidum, so a relative to our Lolium multiflorum, where they have serious issues again with herbicide resistance, and they've really turned to harvest weed seed control in a really, really big way. And they're including all of these types of technologies and techniques. So patch spraying, I'm including that in this group of technologies. Weed surfing, hand roguing, chaff carting, chaff mills, and these seed mills. All different farmers integrate them at different levels. and they're increasingly intensive as you go down that list. But the two that we've been really beginning to focus on is this weed surfing approach and the seed mills as well. So before I actually sort of talk to you about what we found, what do we currently know? Because there's actually currently very limited work on harvest weed seed control in UK and Europe as a whole. I'd say really focused on Canada and Australia so far, where it's getting the most traction. So the work in Europe, generally speaking, has focused on identifying the potential targets. So looking at theoretically, based on the seed shedding patterns for these weeds that we're really dealing with. The only way that harvest weed seed control can work is if the seeds are available to the machinery at the time of harvest. So something like blackgrass has only 29 to 37% seed retention at harvest. It's all for winter wheat harvests. So that was some work in 2020, but we did some work also in 2020 and found about 10 to 20% in winter wheat. However, there might be some more opportunities to use these techniques in something like spring wheat, where 60% is retained, or winter barley, where we're harvesting earlier, and that seed hasn't yet shed. For meadow brome, and this is particularly why it's so important for these regen no-till systems, is that in meadow brome, 80% of seeds are retained at harvest. So we've got a really large target to go at, something that we can really get our teeth into as a target. And Italian ryegrass, say, working across from Australia and the USA on this, their numbers suggested about 80% of seed is retained at harvest. And lowly multiflorum, a subset of work in Europe, has suggested about 70%. So similarly, very, very high levels that we can optimize the cropping around that. The reason why this is so important in regen and no-till systems is, as John has already thoroughly explained, there's a successful weed control in no-till really does rely upon minimal seed rain, having absolutely zero tolerance approach to returning seed back into this really active layer of the seed bank. The herbicides, obviously, currently the main control, as we highlighted, particularly with glyphosate, we cannot always be relied upon. So instead of using it as we kind of almost think of harvest weed seed control as a pre-drilling weed control, but looking at using it in the previous crop. So as you say, again here, so this is another demonstration of where the seeds are in these no-till systems. So the ploughing, you've got this really well-distributed mix of seeds, both old, freshly shed, and older seeds. And then in that no-till where they've really concentrated in that top active layer. And it's really the transition for me that these can be particularly effective, where we're moving into a system that is going to be concentrating those seeds into that no-till, so don't get into that position in the first place. Getting ourselves out of a mess with where the weed seeds are is going to be more difficult, where you're trying to degrade the seed bank. It's a case of trying to stop that seed bank getting in that position in the first place. The targets are obvious in terms of the seed shedding patterns, and these do coexist, certainly coexist in terms of the targets that are also there for regen. So meadow brome and rat's tail fescue to some extent, possibly less so, but very limited work on its seed shedding patterns. But birch chervil, these broadleaf weed species, do retain an awful lot of seed at harvest time, so it could be a really, really strong target. So onto the technology, and hopefully if you've been walking around the show today, you will have seen this. This is the Top Cut Collect, manufactured by Zern, as was actually a farmer-led design who has combined the weed surfer as a very traditional tool to cut off weed heads prior to harvest. One of the limitations of that, of course, is that you are going to be dropping seed heads onto the floor and allowing seeds that are either already viable to then germinate and persist in the seed bank, or enable some sort of post-harvest ripening and retain persistence in the seed bank. So this then connects this cutter bar to a trailer where we can remove the seed head. So it gives us a lot more flexibility around timing. So gives us a real target some of these more common weeds, so something like blackgrass, where actually the ripening time is quite early in the season, as early as May. You will have some viable seeds on the head. But there's the period before they actually shed that we have access to remove them from the field. Again, very limited evidence. This is just based on last year's work, but there seems to be an ability to have something like a 73% reduction in the number of heads from what is left following our herbicide applications and other in-crop control, which is, when you think about it, is actually a very high number and something that I think is slightly surprising. And if you if you think about that in terms of numbers of seed, it really is allowing us to double down on our herbicide programs. So really, this is whilst we are going to continue to look at the top cut collect, the biggest focus is going to be on seed mills over the next couple of years. So the majority of weed seed is actually found in the chaff fraction. So the way that these are working is that they're separating the straw and the chaff fraction in the combine, and sending or diverting the chaff fraction through into a rotary seed mill, which is going to smash the seeds and the rest of the chaff into a very fine powder, rendering it non-viable. So they're attached to the back of the combine in exchange of the chopper, which is then fitted back on top. So an integral part of the unit. An integral part of the unit. So in terms of results so far, as I said, it's all very relatively theoretical, looking at types of seed shedding patterns. However, there has been some limited practical work, a lot of it by ourselves, but also by Frontier and an AHB project back in 2017, 2018. So they looked at chaff lining. So this is a slightly modified modification for the seed mill, in the sense that you're not milling the seed up, but you're diverting it into lines behind the combine, often behind the wheels, and leaving it to be on the surface so it's concentrated, so you're not having to deal with it across your entire field. And then in 2019, we did a single field study with a seed mill in Essex, and we demonstrated there was an 85% reduction in the Italian ryegrass seed viability, having gone through the seed mill, which very much is consistent with other work out there in terms of the direct viability or the direct efficacy, rather, of these seed mills. So this is some work we did last year. So this is the latest part. Again, a single field study, a two field study, but a single year on blackgrass and meadow brome at a site near Cambridge. So there was no observable effect on blackgrass from using these seed mills, which is, as I said, relatively unsurprising. However, meadow brome, we had an 83% reduction in the number of seedlings in the following crop. So that's accounting for the seed bank that we have there. So really, really positive numbers that we can then bring into the research that we're going to be continuing this coming year. So what does that look like? And I'll be really pleased people to be involved with this research. We have it's very much a farm-led project alongside the Boffin network and supported by Redicop, who are the manufacturers of these seed mills. So there's some really, really big questions, particularly for the UK. So obviously, how effective can seed mills be in reducing the populations across different weed species? And therefore, part of that is really working out how much seed is actually getting to these seed mills. So some early work, again, part related to last year, we've got 83% reduction overall, but only about 73% of the seed that we think is available in the field is actually getting to the seed mill. So how can we optimise that for the UK conditions, where we can't keep harvesting every single day? We are liable to have breakdowns and delays due to the weather. So how does that affect how much seed can get to the seed mill? So time of harvest, interact with these species. Are there some species that are more likely to be affected by this? And this critical interval, I think, is really important for this harvest weed seed. So and the pre-harvest weed seed type technologies to really determine how effective they can be. And therefore, what's the effect on combine work rate? Because I think that's the really important thing. I noted it about the inter-row cultivation. How do we deliver this practically on farm? And these new technologies are often going to add time. They're going to add work rate. They're going to require more power from our combines. And how much can we compromise around that? How much are we prepared to invest our time into trying to improve our weed control? But ultimately, do we have a setup? Are our businesses set up to work with these types of machines? So, a quick summary. I think that it's quite clear. Delivering no-till, sustainable weed management within no-till requires this really successful control across a range of species. These species are going to change. It's really important that we get a real grasp of that. A number of these prime candidates are there for harvest weed seed capture. Really, if you were going to name the targets, they are those. So it's nice that these two, the transition goes hand in hand with harvest weed seed control. And this preliminary data does show that there's a real support for the use of seed mills, particularly for meadow brome, and particularly in no-till systems. So I think we've got about 15 minutes for some questions.
We were both very keen to finish on time and go home. Not half as keen as the audience is by the looks of it. But are there any questions?
Would you say that organic and regenerative are mutually incompatible, mutually exclusive?
I think you have to look at this concept of them. Sorry, you have to look at this concept of there being so many different weed control tools and agents, and you're sort of twiddling knobs. If you turn down obviously the in-crop herbicides, you can use inter-row mechanical weeding or direct physical weed control. If you turn down the pre-drilling total weed control to 0, you're just going to have to do more work elsewhere. I don't think they are incompatible, but turning one down to 0 requires turning the others up, and that's, yeah. So you're going to have to work harder.
Hi, you've talked a lot about harvest weed seed control, but you did mention in the first talk that crop rotation and things are also very helpful. Do you think if farmers have weed problems, should they focus first on things like getting a long, good crop rotation in, or do you think the harvest weed seed technologies would be kind of an easier win, and will they work short term or long term? That's the thing.
Yeah, I mean, the experience, as I say, is very important to understand that the French experience of conservation agriculture is around a very formal understanding and prescriptive understanding of what conservation agriculture is. But they are able, because in order to get the money you have to say what you're doing, to describe what level of adoption there was of the 3 pillars. And it looked like the people were, whether it's a mistake or not, adopting the no-till element before the other elements. Because obviously, presumably, there's some money to buy a drill. So there you go. I think in terms of, I'm here and I want to plan a transition into regenerative cropping, the reality is that which of those 3 elements you adopt first will change the problem you have in the transition. If you go to a diverse range of cropping first, so not just I can grow 5 different crops, winter wheat, winter barley, winter oats, rye and triticale, but think about different traits around the crop, so spring, legume, even C4 late spring, winter, broadleaf and monocot. If you have that element, you very quickly reduce the dominance of certain species, but you bring in a much larger range of species, so that makes your in-crop weed management a bit more challenging. You have to get control of more species in the crop. If you go to no-till, you get weeds with that's suited to that system. And obviously, the trying to achieve that cover 365 days a year, that had that interesting effect of bringing in competitive species. So I don't think there's an order, but the reality is the way in which you go about it will influence the challenges that you have along the way. That's why I haven't answered. I've successfully not answered that. There you go. We can go home that little bit earlier.
I think I would just add. I think that I don't think. It's the wrong way of thinking about it, saying I'll adopt a tool so I can keep growing continuous winter wheat. There's other benefits to having a longer rotation. I mean, not just weed management, but if you can have a more diverse weed system, you could argue you won't need to use a harvest weed seed control. So if you start with that, you're sort of looking at the wrong way. It's part of a system. We need to be using the crop rotation first because it's a long-term planning. And then you might use that system in parts of that. I mean, it's not going to work for every single crop. It's not going to work for every single weed in every single crop. So they need to be used in tandem.
I think I would add one of the really fascinating things from the French experience is they looked at, obviously it took a trait-based approach to weed flora because they've got different weed species through the different zones. Because conservation agriculture is so prescriptive, the people who had adopted it for the longest, although they had a higher species diversity, they had higher homogeneity in the traits. Because conservation agriculture adopters, because it's so prescriptive, were more similar to each other than conventional growers were. And I think for me in the UK, the learning has got to be to have flexibility. You know, if we are going to introduce some sort of public policy support around it, we just want to avoid, you know, that. In fact, the objective has been completely, you know, which is to use weed species as an indicator of health in crop. Actually, it's worse because it's so prescriptive, and CA adopters are more similar than conventional growers, and that is one of the really important findings I think that we need to promote a bit more.
So we're as an organic farmer, we find that broadleaf weeds are probably more of a problem than you know, grass weeds. So I'd like to know what, if any, effect you found of the mill on charlock seed, poppy seed, that type of thing. I suspect it may be very minor. And the other thing, I didn't know whether you'd got involved in what we're working on with living mulch, that is to say keeping a carpet of low-growing clovers and then drilling into that, and what effect that might have on, particularly on grassweed seeds.
So I'll answer the first bit. So the harvest weed seed control element for broadleaf weeds, it is going to be species dependent. We've got a fantastic range of broadleaf weeds in the field, 29 species of broadleaf weeds, quite impressive. So things like poppy is going to retain the seed. I think charlock is going to generally drop its seed before a winter wheat harvest. Same for groundswell. Is another big broadleaf weed in certainly no-till, and I think same for organics. So I think it's about the target of the weed, but the weed cutter, that would be a target for, or charlock would be a target for that type of technology. Also, sorry.
We use a thing called a comb cut, which is a Swedish machine, which is very similar to that. It's probably a lot cheaper and slightly more rudimentary. And that's very successful on garlic, very successful. And in fact, we're breeding a dwarf charlock now, so we've used it for so long. We can hardly use it now.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's obviously the downside. You select for herbicide resistance. Some of these technologies, I think, maybe less the seed mill, but certainly the ability to be cutting weed surfing as a general tool. You are going to be, over a long period of time, selecting for slightly shorter weeds, which then renders it, you know, almost completely useless. So,
but by the same token, the charlock is getting later, and therefore keeping its seed at harvest longer. Do you see what I mean? Because we're cutting off the lead shoot, and it's then depending on reproduction from the lower shoots, and so it's getting commensurately later. Yeah. So I think we're getting a lot of charlock seed and poppy seed in the combine, so I'm assuming that, you know, that is available to be milled. I'm just wondering what effect whether the mill would do a milling job or whether it wouldn't.
Oh yeah, no, it would do a milling job on those weeds. Yeah, there's again, work from Australia. They've looked at a wide range of species, and charlock was one of those, and there was good control from there. I think some of the work. I think so wild oats is a weed that tends to drop its seeds very early in harvest, isn't accessible to the weed mill. However, exactly as you say, if we can use one technique to lower it, it'll reshoot, and then those seeds are then held. Then you can then use the seed mill. So using these technologies in tandem to again double down on the effect. The weakness of one plays into the strength of the other. The living mulches.
I mean, I'll pick up a couple of points as well. We did use a comb cut, and a health and safety nightmare is all I could say about that. We're much more comfortable with the Zern. I was very uncomfortable watching it in operation. I think, you know, over-reliance on any mode of weed management is counterproductive in the end. And in Australia, where they've obviously aggressively used harvest weed seed control, they are finding weeds are being selected for earlier, and therefore avoiding the mill. So, you know, over-reliance on any mode of weed management is unhealthy. We want diversity in the weed management as we want diversity in the weeds themselves. So we've we only get one go a year, obviously, as you know, like everyone else. We've done a little bit of work around what you describe as living mulches. So we're basically talking about companion cropping. And, we've got the technology. You could almost have a perennial vegetation and annual vegetation side by side and almost a mini rotation in a metre square. I would say we haven't been very successful at actually doing that. What we're going to do this year is to effectively relay crop the companion crop and start it off in the standing crop, because our problem this year was that by the time we want species in the understory which we think are valuable, by the time they got going, the crop was already in stem extension, so we've got a very vertical companion crop which is not helping with weed suppression. We want to create that understory, almost mow it and then drill into it. So yes, I think that's another tool. There's a strong interaction with the drill system, whether you're disking, tining, or strip tilling. I think we're going to have to be adapting these systems to individual scenarios on farm. But you only get the one go a year, don't you? That's the problem with agriculture. Yeah. I mean, if you haven't got it right after 50 goes, you probably ought to stop anyway. No, I mean, we've reached a different phase now. The longer we talk, the less we have to do to take the stand down. So we're very happy.
Oh, right. I'm sorry. I thought I'd come to the wrong talk because I really wanted to hear about how to deal with docks and thistles and ragwort in organic pasture. But you'll say you just have to leave them there. And what can I do about that? What can we do about that?
So we were asked to talk about narrow row, broad acre crops and tools. Sorry.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm in my first year of no-till, and I've already noticed I've got a lot of broadleaves creeping in from headlands, and the field edges is becoming a problem, and I'm going to probably end up cultivating this year that headland strip just to define the field edge better. Long term, you're saying crimper or something for broadleaves would be a good tool in the arsenal, or have you got any other suggestions so I don't have to start cultivating again?
I mean, that's an option if you want to go in that direction. Probably that is something that you would think about if you do want to go organic, or you'll have a dislike of glyphosate because that's its function. While you've got very high efficacy from glyphosate, use glyphosate presumably. Got some very good herbicides in crop.
Yeah, we're using herbicides, glyphosates, cover cropping, broad scale, arable, but definitely we've noticed field edges, just that first 6 meters off the margin, just getting a lot of creep already. I'm thinking, long term.
I mean, I think introducing cultivation into that zone to try and exclude them from the field body is probably going to be a good compromise, isn't it?
Yep. Thank you.
Are you aware of a good way of terminating temporary pasture other than ploughing or glyphosate?
No. There you go. Right. Well, there's still a few posts left, but that looks like it's the end of it. Thank you for coming along. It's been a bloody long 2 days, but really appreciate your attention. And I hope, and obviously if you're interested in what Will's been talking about, all our emails are firstname.secondname@noab.com. If you want to discuss anything I raised, the same is true. So thank you very much, and do enjoy your trip home, I guess. Thank you.